The barn door groans open, and the family just stands there. Inside are sacks of rye and barley, the whole year stacked against one wall. Not enough. They can see it before anyone says it. This grain must become bread in winter, porridge in spring, ale for the table, rent for the Lord, seed for next year, and feed for the animals that pull the plow. Every scoop has already been claimed. No one is starving yet. That is what makes the moment worse. The disaster begins with arithmetic. Count the mouths, count the weeks, count the sacks. Then understand that summer is too far away. So how does one bad harvest become more than hunger? How does it break households, villages, and the moral order people lived by? Because in a medieval village, grain was never just dinner, it was the operating system of life. That is the thread we are going to follow. Not famine as a single empty bowl, but famine as a chain reaction. One failed harvest moves through a village the way fire moves through dry thatch. First the field, then the barn, then the market, then the debts, then the rules people thought would hold. The common picture is simple. People had less food, so they grew hungry. True, but too small. In the medieval world, survival depended on reserves that were thin, markets that were local, and obligations that did not disappear just because the rain came wrong. Rent was still owed, seeds still had to be saved, animals still needed fodder, children still needed bread. So the question is not only how much grain was missing. The better question is who had to give something up first. A peasant household might cut meals, then sell a pig, then borrow against next year, then eat the seed that was supposed to go into the ground. Each choice solved one day and damaged the next. And once many families faced that choice together, private hunger became public crisis. The first shock was obvious. There was less grain. The second was worse. Suddenly, everyone needed it at the same time. At the market, the failure became visible in the price. A sack of grain that had been barely affordable in a normal year now climbed beyond reach. Not because every barn was empty, not yet, but because less grain was arriving, and everyone could see it. That mattered most in towns. A village household might still have a strip of land, a few stored sheaves, a neighbor with an obligation to help. A wage laborer in a town had something much weaker, coins. If bread doubled, the body did not need half as much food. Demand stayed hard because grain was not a luxury. It was the meal. Bread, porridge, ale. Calories in their simplest form. So prices rose fastest, where people depended on buying what they ate. Then fear entered the market. If you believed grain would be dearer next week, you bought more today. If you owned grain, you waited. A merchant held back a cart. A lord kept stores inside the manor. A farmer delayed selling, hoping for a better price. Each decision made sense alone. Together, they made the market feel emptier than it was. This is where shortage became panic. The wealthy could still purchase grain at the new price. They complained, but they ate. The poor spent rent money, tool money, seed money. They sold hens, cloth, pots, anything that could become bread. And with every purchase, the gap widened. Those with reserves protected themselves. Those without reserves were stripped bare. But paying more for bread was only the beginning, because every loaf eaten now created a question about what would be planted later. A peasant household did not look at a pile of grain and see only food. It saw claims. Some grain had to become bread now. Some had to go to the Lord as rent, tithe, or customary dues. Some had to feed the animals that pulled the plow. And some had to be kept dry, guarded, and untouched until sowing time. That last share was seed corn. It was not special because it tasted different. It was special because it belonged to the future. Each handful saved for the field was a wager that the household would survive long enough to harvest it back many times over. In a normal year, this was harsh but manageable. The bins were divided, the obligations were met, the seed was set aside. In a bad year, the arithmetic turned cruel. If the family ate the seed, they could quiet hunger today. Children stopped crying. A weak parent stood up again. A pot filled for one more meal. But spring would come anyway, and when it came, an empty seed bin meant an empty strip of land. Less sown meant less harvested. Poor seed meant weak growth. Borrowed seed meant starting the year already in debt, often owing back more grain than had been received. So the choice was not simply eat or plant. It was eat now and risk starving later, or save seed and watch hunger remain in the room. This is how famine became self-reinforcing. The failed harvest did not end when the last sheaf was counted. It reached forward into the next planting, shrinking the very thing that might have repaired the damage. And because every household faced the same calculation, the danger spread beyond one family. Fewer fields were sown, more debts were made, more people became dependent on those with full barns. Famine was not only the absence of food, it was the moment when tomorrow itself had to be spent, and when grain could no longer serve every purpose, households turned to the only other store of value they had, their animals. Animals were not decoration on a medieval holding. An ox was muscle. It dragged the plow through heavy soil when human backs could not. A cow was milk, butter, and calves. Sheep were wool for clothing and fleece for rent. Pigs turned acorns, peelings, and scraps into meat. Even their dung mattered, because manure was what put strength back into exhausted fields. So when fodder ran short, the crisis changed shape. A family might have grain enough to keep people alive, but not enough hay, straw, or oats to carry animals through winter. Keeping the ox meant feeding the ox. Feeding the ox meant taking food from the household or selling something else to buy fodder at famine prices. Then came the terrible calculation. Sell the cow now, while she is thin but still worth something. Slaughter the pig before it reaches full size. Drive sheep to market before the wool is ready. Kill the animal that would have produced food, labor, and manure for years, because tonight there is nothing else to eat, and because many households reached that decision together, the market turned against them. Roads filled with animals that families could no longer keep. Buyers knew it. Prices fell. The desperate seller received less coin at the exact moment every loaf, every sack of oats, every handful of salt cost more. It was relief, but it was relief with a blade hidden inside it. When spring returned, the missing animals left empty spaces in the work itself. No ox meant slower plowing. No cow meant less milk. Fewer sheep meant less wool. Less manure meant weaker soil. The famine had eaten the tools of recovery. Once the animals were gone, many families had only one thing left to trade: their future earnings. Future earnings could be borrowed against. A neighbor with a fuller barn might lend a sack of rye. A miller might advance grain on the promise of payment after threshing. A landlord, merchant, or moneylender might offer coin when coin was the only way to buy bread. For a starving household, this was not greed. It was survival measured in handfuls. But debt changed the famine from a hunger crisis into a legal one. The rent was still due. The tithe still had to be paid. Labor services still belonged to the Lord. In some places, taxes or fees pressed in as well. A bad harvest did not automatically cancel the obligations written into custom, contract, and memory. And that was the trap. If a family borrowed grain in winter, they had to repay after the next harvest. But the next harvest was not guaranteed. Seed might be weak, animals might be missing, fields might be poorly plowed. So the household that survived one season entered the next already claimed by someone else. Then came the selling. Not the animals now. Smaller things. A bronze pot, a cloak, a spare shirt, iron tools, rights to use a strip of land, little pieces of security that made poverty survivable. Each sale bought time. Each sale narrowed the future. Landlords were not all the same. Some delayed payment. Some reduced demands. Some took what they could and waited for the rest. But even partial enforcement could ruin a family already living at the edge. Because obligation did not need to be cruel to be crushing. It only had to continue. And when the village could no longer absorb the pain, people began looking beyond it, toward roads, towns, monasteries, and strangers, so they left. A man might walk toward a nearby town because wages were paid in coin there. A widow might take children to a monastery gate hoping for bread. A younger son might set out for an uncle's village where the harvest was rumored to be better. The road became a second famine landscape. Not empty fields, but moving bodies. Families carrying bundles. Men looking for day labor. Children with swollen bellies. Beggars waiting near bridges, markets, church doors, and the entrances to walled towns. Towns pulled people in because they had what villages lacked: markets, bakers, employers, religious houses, wealthy households that might give alms. But towns were not rescue machines. More mouths meant higher demand. Higher demand meant dearer bread. And charity, even when sincere, had limits. A hospital could feed some, a monastery could distribute loaves on certain days, a parish could help its own poor before strangers. That word mattered, stranger. In medieval life, survival depended on being known. Your kin knew your needs, your neighbors knew your labor. Your parish knew whether you belonged. Once hunger pushed people onto the road, those proofs weakened. At the same time, the villages they left behind grew weaker. Fewer hands to plow, fewer relatives to share food, fewer neighbors to repair a roof, watch a child, bury the dead. Movement spread the crisis outward. A failed harvest in one place became begging in another. A shortage of grain became suspicion at a town gate. A household's private desperation became a public problem that everyone could see, and not everyone wanted to help. For those who stayed or arrived with nothing, survival increasingly depended on one question: who still felt responsible for them? Responsibility had rules. A monastery might bake extra loaves for the poor at its gate. A lord might order grain handed out from his barn. A wealthy household might give leftovers after a feast, or a parish priest might collect alms for widows, orphans, and the sick. But help was never just help. It carried judgment. Medieval charity was shaped by Christian duty, but also by reputation, local obligation, and the question of who deserved relief. The old widow from the parish might be seen as worthy. The injured laborer might be pitied. The unknown beggar at the gate might be suspected of laziness, fraud, or danger. And when harvest failed, the line grew harder. There were too many hands reaching for too little bread. Hospitals filled. Monastic stores shrank. Lords had tenants to keep alive, soldiers to feed, debts to pay. Even kindness became a calculation. Then hunger crossed another boundary. A man who had never stolen before might take wood from a lord's forest. A mother might snatch grain from a cart. Someone might kill a sheep in the dark, not to profit, but to cook it before morning. Authorities did not always treat hunger as an excuse. Theft was still theft. Poaching was still poaching. Breaking into a barn threatened more than property. It threatened the order that kept everyone in place. So trust began to rot. Neighbors hid sacks under floorboards. Mills were watched. Strangers were turned away. A village that once survived by lending tools, sharing labor, and remembering favors, now measured every face against its own empty store. Famine was not only the absence of food, it was the moment when every bond people depended on was tested at once. And then hunger did something even more dangerous. It weakened bodies just as people crowded together in search of relief. The danger was not just that people had eaten less. It was that they had no reserve left. A poor harvest emptied barns. High prices emptied purses. Debt claimed the seed grain. Rents still came due. Roads were muddy. Carts were scarce. And grain sitting in one district might as well have been across the sea if no one could move it cheaply enough. So the crisis spread through gaps. A laborer weakened by thin pottage could not work a full day. A child short on bread became easier prey for fever. Families walked toward towns, abbeys, and market centers, looking for alms or wages, and carried sickness with them. The very places built to offer help became crowded, dirty, and overwhelmed. This is the turn. The villain was not one cruel lord. It was not only bad weather. It was a world with too little slack, too little storage, too little transport, too little cash, too few rights for the people at the bottom. There was food somewhere, but somewhere did not save you. Reach did. So when we return to that first family staring into the barn, we can finally see what they were really facing. They were facing a chain. One failed harvest meant less grain in the barn. Less grain meant higher prices at market. Higher prices meant families sold tools, animals, and clothing. Then came the cruelest bargain: eat the seed now, or save it and go hungry. Either choice damaged tomorrow. Without seed, the next field shrank. Without oxen, the plow moved slower. Without cash, debt tightened. Without strength, work failed. And when neighbors, churches, and lords were asked to help more people with fewer resources, charity became rationed. Trust became suspicion, and desperation spilled into theft, flight, and disease. That is how a shortage became a famine. Food was the beginning. But what truly failed was the web around it. storage, transport, credit, obligation, health, and the belief that someone would catch you before you fell. Medieval famine destroyed choices before it destroyed lives. If this helped you see the chain more clearly, subscribe for more history explained this way, and tell me in the comments which link in the chain felt most devastating to you. Thanks for watching.